We are going to think about the details of New Testament text this morning. Now, when I was a child, I never thought about the things that were just there. No, when I opened the tap, there was water, and I didn't wonder where the water came from. I had a belly button. Never thought, where does my belly button come from? Or the road in front of our house, where did that come from? No, it's simply there. No, we simply accept their existence. And for many, the Bible is one of those things. No? If we are Christians, often we simply accept that the Bible is there. No, God gave His word, and we do not wonder where it came from, how it got here. No, the Bible simply is. Now, in 2003, the New Testament scholar Badhoevedorp produced a popular work called Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why. And in the UK, this was published under a slightly different title, a little bit more polite, less aggressive, but it's the same book. Whose word is it? And Ehrman's idea is that the New Testament was changed after it was initially written. And of course, our Bibles are in English or Afrikaans or Xhosa or any of the languages we speak, and they were all translations from the original Greek in which the New Testament was written. But Ehrman's idea was that the Bible was changed to help out in certain theological debates that were raging in the early church. And he claims that the text was adapted so that it actually said what the people wanted it to say. No? A little bit like changing a government report so that the findings of the report actually suit the purposes of the government. Would never happen here, but in the UK it has been known to have happened. Now, for many people, this book was a shock to the system. The Bible apparently is not simply one of those things that just is. No, there is actually a story to be told about how and why it is what it is. And in Ehrman's title, already a seed of suspicion is sown. No? In the New Testament that we have now, there is a bias put in by the powers that be. And this adds up, of course, neatly to what people already know about the history of the Bible, which they have learned from watching the Da Vinci Code. You know, that there was a council in Nicaea fighting over which books would be put in the Bible and which books were had to be out. Now, the Council of Nicaea fought about many things, but they did not fight about which books were in the Bible and which ones were out. Actually, the two parties, the Council of Nicaea, agreed on that already. Why? Because that had been sorted out centuries early. But then, Ehrman says there is no positive reason to take the Bible serious. No, on the contrary. And it has become part of the popular narrative that the Bible has been doctored, has been edited, and you can't really accept it. For example, the church was debating the status of Jesus as being the Son of God. Now, and therefore, there were some people, according to Badhoevedorp, who changed the Bible to make Jesus more the Son of God than the Bible actually originally claimed. So that is the notion. And we're going to look at one of those examples a little bit. And they changed it to make Jesus more the Son of God to influence the outcome of the debates. Now, the winners were called the Orthodox Church. The losers were called heretics. So that is the sort of history that is being painted about the early church. And there is something attractive about it, because we are nowadays programmed to side with those who are oppressed, who are basically persecuted by the church, and definitely the church can't be a good thing. So it is that sort of narrative that primes us to take this seriously. However, Edmund wrote this popular book. He also wrote an academic book, which is actually what I knew. And in his academic book, he has to admit something. And he says this about the changes in the New Testament. The changes appear to be made at an early date for theological reasons. We're going to think about that. But they appear to be made at an early date for theological reasons. Yet they occur randomly in various textual witnesses, not at all with the kind of consistency one might expect. Now, here there is an interesting sort of scholarly thing going on, because just for logic, if you have a hypothesis, changes for theological reasons, and then you have the actual data that don't seem to support your main thesis, what should you do with your original hypothesis? Doubt it, reject it, or whatever? But Edmund does not do that, even though there is not the changes with the consistency you might expect. He still maintains his thesis. But still, what happened with the New Testament during those many centuries of copying the text by hand before the printing press was invented? To what extent have perhaps anonymous people had their hand in shaping the New Testament over the course of centuries? What are the details in the New Testament that are transmitted reliably? And what are perhaps some of the details that have suffered a little bit? Now, often the general reliability of the New Testament has been defended by pointing to the number of manuscripts. We have so many of the manuscripts of the New Testament that we can show that the words are reliable. But what, and siding here with Edmund again, what if those manuscripts actually demonstrate that the text was not stable at all? That there are so many errors that we cannot know the original anymore? How can we know that the New Testament we hold in our hands is basically the same as that written 2,000 years ago? So this is our main thesis for this morning. If tiny details have come across, then we have good reason to believe that the text has preserved the bigger message too. And this is a very important one to keep in mind, because we're going to have a look at the tiny details, and we'll see how the New Testament is reliable, so that you may have even more trust that everything that goes above the tiniest details is therefore reliable too. It basically goes all about copying. So copying a text is a process in which you want to get the words of the mother manuscripts all the way down to the child. And the way to get the words down from this place to that place is by means of a scribe. Over the last 100 years, we have learned a lot about the human mind. Because the human mind is involved in the copying. And we have learned about in how many ways somebody can mess up the copying process. Let me give you an example of the art of reading. No, reading, we think, okay, we read every word on a page, and that is kind of how we produce a text. Well, I think most of us can read what's here. No, unbelievable, but true. Researchers at Oxford University, no, Cambridge University, have discovered that most people can read this without problems. This is because they only need the first and last letters of each word to understand a text. And I think your experience will be pretty much like that. It is quite readable once you get going. Now, it is amazing how robust reading is. We have all those safety guards already in mind that we can auto-correct a text very easily on the spot. So this is what it actually looks like in real. However, I introduced here an error. Does anyone see the error on the screen? What is wrong? Indeed, somebody has picked it up already. There we are. The word "the" is but if you read it initially, you don't notice it. We are trained to see patterns, but we are even trained to see patterns where there are no patterns. Because what do we have here? Well, if I asked you to describe this image, perhaps you would say is that we have here a white parallelogram, sort of on top of 4 black rectangles. But it's of course not really true, because the only thing on the screen are 4 black irregular shapes. And we impose the parallelogram on top of it, because that is how our brain works. We are looking for patterns, and we find those patterns. So that is the other side. Sometimes we may see a pattern when in reality there is no pattern. So that's the other thing about reading. Right, let's go to a manuscript. This is what a New Testament manuscript looks like. And what we are going to do in the coming minutes is to think briefly about what process is involved to produce a New Testament manuscript in the early centuries. And I hope to show you some details that demonstrate how well the text has been transmitted. Despite centuries copying by hand, despite scribes making many individual mistakes, still tiny details of the text can be studied and we can learn from it. So what we are not going to do is to give you 7 reasons why the text of the New Testament is reliable. No, I want you to understand internally what the process is, so that you're not afraid of it and have a framework to think about it. So if tiny details have come across, there is good reason to assume that the text has preserved the bigger message too. What do you need in order to copy? Well, you need 3 things. First, you need a mother manuscript, something that you can copy from. Then, the second thing is you need many individual cycles of copying. So one cycle is you read a few words, you remember a few words, you write a few words. And if you do that often enough, you have copied a whole New Testament. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is, of course, the child. You need to have the physical stuff for the child. You need to write down. And if you are a good scribe, afterwards you correct it. Because a good scribe knows that he will make copying errors. It's almost unavoidable. So, let's see. There we are. The first phase is the reading part. Well, if you are at a remote place, somewhere in the north of Scotland or down south on the Antarctic, you would be very glad if you would have even one mother manuscript. Now, you would take whatever you would get because there are so very few Bibles around in early days. If you lived in a big city, you would go for the best manuscript, probably copied in or kept in the biggest church, and you would ask to take that as your mother. But otherwise, you knew you needed to prepare your mother manuscript, and you would copy from there. In an ideal world, no, you would go for the oldest and approved copy. And we know already from the church fathers that those oldest and approved copies functioned as the sort of center, linchpin, and then from there other copies were made. And from those copies, other copies were made. And the further away you got from the oldest and approved copies that functioned as the central linchpins, quite often the more errors had been introduced in the process. Well, then you go for the copying. And we have thought already about reading. Well, here we have a textual variant from 2 Corinthians 1:12, where we have the two Greek words that we find in the manuscript. Is there anyone, I mean, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but just want to see hand. Is there anyone who has learned Greek at any point or is studying Greek here? 3, oh, wonderful. Brilliant. I hope to inspire many others sort of now kind of in your retirement or whatever. Pick up Greek, that's something useful to do. Now, we have two Greek words on top, and the one word means with simplicity, that's this word, and the other one means with holiness, and that is this word. Now, we talked about reading with, you need the first letter and the final letters, and then you roughly have the word. Can you see how similar those words are? And if you have handwriting, here we have the second and the third letter, which is a gamma and an iota. If those two are close enough, you get the letter pi. So what we learn from this difference is that the difference came into being not because somebody wanted to change the text, but the difference came into being because of a simple reading error. Now, that is an important observation. There's no malice involved. No, it is a reading error. And this will be a theme of this morning. Never ascribe to malice what can be explained by incompetence. That's a very good rule in textual criticism. It's a good rule in life in general. No, it is not evil intent. It is just simple error. Right, we're going to the next one. When you are reading, you, for a moment, you take your eyes away from the mother manuscript. Which means that when your eyes go back to the mother manuscript, there is a chance that they will land at the wrong place. And here we have a section from a manuscript I know quite well, where the scribe, after he had written 1 Thessalonians 2:13, he arrived in verse 14, and there are 7 letters in verse 14, which also appeared in verse 13. So rather than, when his eyes went back to the mother manuscript, continuing in verse 14, he went back in the mother manuscript to verse 13 and wrote this bit of text a second time underneath there. And he did not notice, because clearly he went on the automatic pilot. And then after he hit the same 7 letters again, he simply continued as he was supposed to be. Now, a later corrector actually noticed, hey, you've done something silly here. So the later corrector put those little hooks in the margin to indicate, hey, something is wrong here. But initially, the scribe did not notice. Now, you can skip backwards, and that is normally easy to spot because you get the same text twice. You can also skip forwards. Those are the tricky ones because, skipping forwards, what's the missing text? Well, sometimes you end up with a perfect readable text and you don't know something is left out. So skipping forward is a dangerous thing. The other thing is, back to our monk, is the second thing is memory. Now, your memory is all perfect, mine isn't. It has happened more than once that I was absolutely sure that either my wife had moved the car keys, which I left on the table, or my children, or the dog, or anyone else, till that awkward moment you find them in your own pocket. And you can still remember, if you think long and hard enough, the physical act of moving, of putting the keys down. You have the physical memory. Memory is deceptive, especially when you are copying, for example, the Gospel of Luke, and you have learned the Gospel of Matthew by heart. Isn't that a bit over the top, learning the Gospel of Matthew by heart? Well, if you wanted to enter a monastery in the 4th century in Egypt, there was one requirement that stipulates you know one of the 4 Gospels by heart, you know one of the letters of Paul by heart. And that was only to enter into the monastery. So you know a Gospel by heart, and you are reading the Gospel of Luke, and what has happened is Luke has a tendency to tell the same story in fewer words than Matthew does. So what happens when you are copying the Gospel of Luke and you know the longer version of Matthew? Well, we're going to see. And this is a good example where older manuscripts have preserved the correct text and the younger manuscripts have suffered from the extra addition. And those are reflected in the King James Version on the younger manuscripts. So what Jesus says, Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone." If you read this, just in Luke, everyone is adding almost words, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God, which is indeed what we find in the younger manuscript, but by every word of God. Where do those extra words come from? Well, Matthew 4, verse 4, actually the same verse, has indeed the longer version. But the older manuscripts have preserved the short. So Matthew has the longer text, which was remembered into Luke, the parallel. In the next verse, the devil took him up and showed him all the kingdoms of the world. And then the younger manuscripts have the devil taking him up into a high mountain, so onto a high mountain. Where do the younger manuscripts get that extra phrase from? Again, from the parallel in Matthew. It's exactly the same thing. In verse 8, Jesus answered, "It is written," or what the younger manuscripts have, he said, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Well, there are 2 places where the "get thee behind me, Satan" can come from. One is from later in Luke, when Jesus rebukes Peter. But the more likely candidate is again the way how Matthew has recorded the story with the words, "Get thee behind me, Satan," in. So we have 3 examples, all from the same story, where we see that the younger manuscripts have picked up the text as it is found in Matthew, the other side. Is this a pattern? Yes, it is, because further down in the same chapter, when there is a citation from Isaiah, the older manuscripts have to proclaim good news to the poor, while the newer manuscripts have the extra phrase, to heal the brokenhearted. Now this time, the extra phrase, to heal the brokenhearted, does not come from a parallel in Matthew, but to heal the brokenhearted comes from all the way back in Isaiah, where it is found. Now, a text with to heal the brokenhearted is not unbiblical, because it is found in the Bible, but it is not what Luke originally wrote at this point. No, Luke wrote a shorter version, and that has been then adapted later on. And once you see this pattern of Luke kind of picking up phrases that was originally elsewhere, we start to understand what many of us will have come across when we were reading the Gospel of Luke and we read the Lord's Prayer in Luke. Because we all know the Lord's Prayer, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, if you read the Lord's Prayer in Luke, it is simply, your will be done. And not with the on earth as it is in heaven. Why? Well, we have learned Luke tends to have a shorter version of things than what we find in Matthew. So it helps us to understand some of the things that are going on. Okay, so we've had the reading, we have the memory, and then we get speaking out the text to your own hand. I don't know if you've ever seen a 4 or a 5-year-old who is starting to learn to write. And if you look at her mouth, then you can almost see that the lips are saying the words that they are writing. Now you can see the lips move. And that is how copying works. We read a few words, or we keep it in mind. How do we keep a few words in mind? By repeating them again and again. It's the same with a telephone number, no? 243-821, 243-821. And then we are writing it down, and we 243-821. We say the text to our hand. And this is called the phonological loop, when you remember it, and then the phonological loop is broken when you dictate the words to your hand. It means that there is some sort of voice element in how you copy. And that is where we get spelling errors coming in. I want to give you an example from an old manuscript from the 3rd century that has the letters of Paul. And there are a few words in Greek that are pronounced very, very similar by this time. So Paul in Ephesians walk in love, and as also Christ loved us and gave himself for us. And the word us is underlined in Greek and would be pronounced by this time already as imas. So he loved us, imas. He loved imas. Other manuscripts do not have Christ loved us, but Christ loved you and gave himself for you. And the word here underlined as you is pronounced exactly the same, imas. Both the upsilon and the eta are pronounced as an e sound, as it is done in modern Greek as well. So we get quite a few variants between things like this, Christ loved us or Christ loved you. Now, here it is an interesting thing. Let's think about when Paul says, Christ loved you. Does Paul then want to say that Christ did not love Paul himself? No, of course not. That would be a ridiculous thought even to entertain. No, of course, but when Paul says Christ loved you, he puts the focus on the readers, of those who are reading the letter or are hearing the letter being read to them. So it is, Christ loved you, that emphasis. If Paul had said Christ loved us, he includes himself as well. Look, Christ loved us and he gave himself for us. It is a slightly different emphasis. But what Paul wants to say, what he wants to convey, is not fundamentally different in any way. Now, this variation between you and us is one of the most, may I say it, annoying one throughout the Greek New Testament. There are dozens and dozens of them. And most of the time, it's very easy to solve them. Sometimes, as in this case, it is a bit more difficult. But then we learn that it does not make that much difference. So finally, the whole copying cycle finishes with the movement of the hand. Now, I don't know, but in my experience, most people can think quicker and speak quicker than they can write. So what happens is that your hand is constantly playing catch-up with your thinking and with your speaking when you are copying. And it means that sometimes your hand involuntarily skips a small word or skips a syllable or something. And we see that happen all the time, which means that, okay, here we have a variant where it's clearly happened because the hand could not catch up or could not stay with the speed of speaking. So we have the whole process of bringing the words from the mother to the child, which goes through various stages, and each of these stages can even interact with one another. But happily, some scribes, the good ones, they corrected a manuscript, sometimes immediately after they had written it. Sometimes there was a reader who corrected the manuscript centuries after it was originally written. So if you have this example, let's see if we can find this example. This is from the Old Testament, actually, from Nehemiah. Here we get somebody who really went wild with all his corrections because the original was not copied very well, and made all sorts of additions to the text that the scribe had forgotten. But at least it has been corrected. That is the reassuring part. But what happens if you have your copy and after a few years you are traveling to the big city and you have the chance to correct your own copy against the very good Bible that the bishop has there in the center church? Well, then you get a copy made from a manuscript quite far removed compared to a copy from a completely different line of transmission, and you get mixture of readings. That is why pure genealogy does not work in establishing the sort of the genealogy of manuscripts, because you get a reading popping up here, then suddenly popping up there, as if the same genetic material has jumped from one side of the family tree to another family side, other side of the family tree. And that happens because people brought their manuscripts and kept on correcting them against other things. It is surprising still that despite people's incompetence, the text has been preserved so well. So what can we work with? What does a New Testament manuscript look like? Well, these are the oldest two fragments of the New Testament we have. And they may come from the 2nd century. We don't have anything older, but this may come from the 2nd century. And the thing is, No, written on papyrus. Papyrus is, well, I see it grow everywhere here outside. That's fantastic, all the gardens. But papyrus is fragile. It doesn't stay good for centuries unless it is buried in the dry sands of Egypt. So that's the only place where we find papyrus manuscripts. And even these two fragments, one comes from the Gospel of John, the other from Matthew, that's the only bit that survived from what may have been a complete Gospel book of John, may have been complete Matthew. But it's only these bits that were found on the rubbish heaps. So the fact that something has been preserved is already quite nice. Now, they are fragments. In order to build a complete Gospel of John from fragments such as this, you need hundreds and hundreds of them. We don't have them. There's just the single one. You may see that there is no really good word division. So the words were most often written together, though sometimes there is a little bit, but not here and further down. That was just a feature of how Greek was written. Now, all those spaces between words, it's just a waste of space, basically. Why you can just read it out when you go along. Now, these hands, though, the script, the font that is being used, is a real known font. So these are scribes that had learned to write different fonts. And a good scribe could write, basically Times New Roman, Arial, or some of the other things you have on your computer. A good scribe mastered various fonts. And this is a good bookhand font. And the other thing is, we have text at the front and text at the back, which means that this comes from a book. So a book that has folded pages, and you write on one page, then on this page, then on the next one, and then on the back again. So what is the alternative to writing on a book? Anyone? Writing on a scroll, which was the normal way how books were written in the 1st and the 2nd and the 3rd century. So you would write a column, then unroll a bit, write the next column, unroll a bit further, write the next column. So it is interesting that Christians, from the very beginning on, always wrote on books. And it was a new technology. We know about books from the 1st century in Rome. There was a Roman author who writes about that marvelous new invention of books, that it's so easy, you only need one hand to read it. And then with the other hand, you can flip a page. Great when you're traveling, reading a book. That's actually what he says about it. But proper literature had to be written on scrolls. It's fascinating. Christians, new technology, picked it up immediately. Early adopters of it. And the New Testament is always written on a book rather than a scroll. And actually it may be that the Apostle Paul in Timothy already talks about books, because he tells Timothy to bring the books, which is a neutral word, and then he says especially and the Greek word is membrane, membranae. And often it is translated as especially the parchments, and that's correct, because membrane is the skin sort of thing. But it was also the technical word for a folded book. So it may well be that we find already in Paul's letters a reference to the earliest adoption of the book as the way to distribute Greek New Testaments. So these are the oldest ones. Let's see if we can get a next slide. This manuscript called P46 has all the letters of Paul together. Comes from a century later, 3rd century. By this time, it was physically impossible to have one book with the whole New Testament in it. because bookbinding technology had not developed far enough to create a book that's thick enough for a whole New Testament. So if you had a whole New Testament, you would have one book with the 4 Gospels. You would have a book with Acts and some letters, and then a book with all the letters of Paul together, sort of thing. So you would have several volumes that made up the New Testament. It is only from the 3rd century onward that you will get complete New Testaments. These papyri manuscripts, sometimes they are written very carefully, sometimes they are written a bit sloppily. But it is interesting that already by the end of the 2nd century, around the year 180, around the year 190, there was a church father called Irenaeus. And Irenaeus lived in France, and that's the opposite side of the Mediterranean, sort of. So Israel, Palestine is to the right, and France is all the way to the left. And Irenaeus wrote a big book against all the heresies, he called it, and he discusses a problem, because he had manuscripts of the book of Revelation with the number of the beast, and the number of the beast is 666. And he had manuscripts that said 616. Can you imagine that 616 is the original one? What are you going to do with all your heavy metal t-shirts? No, number of the beast. Going to go adapt them all to 616 again? Now, this is what Irenaeus says, and he gives us some reason to believe why it is 666. The first is, the number 666 is found in all the most approved and ancient copies. By the way, the approved and ancient copies. So he has normal copies and the approved and ancient copies. How old could his ancient copy be if he writes in the year 180? Well, Book of Revelation, either written in the 60s or in the 90s, can't have been older than 110 years. So ancient copies in his days may have been 70 or 80 years, but can't have been 200 years because the book of Revelation did not exist then. So, okay, he has already old numbers. And then he adds something here. Those men who saw John face to face giving that testimony. Because Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, and Polycarp had sat at the feet of John himself. So he had still living memory evidence of, hey, yes, Polycarp, my teacher, has it from John himself that it is indeed 666. Now, I can't use that argument anymore. No, that doesn't work. But in his days, he still could use it. And then his third reason to believe that it is 666 is that it is also logic. Now, then he says that he has manuscripts with 616. And he basically says that the middle letter of 666, which is here in iota, it should have been a xi, which means 60. Instead, it is an iota, and therefore, because of the change of one digit or one letter that depicts a digit, it became 616. And interesting enough, in this papyrus manuscript, we have indeed a 616. So we have manuscripts that confirm what Irenaeus had said, that there was a variant number around. So Christians have always discussed these differences in manuscripts. We never made a secret of it. Why have we always discussed them? Because Christians have a strong acknowledgement that we are fallible. We make errors. And let's face it, The Holy Spirit did not do a very special miracle that every time somebody was copying scripture, he was miraculously prevented from making an error. Because let's face it, some people who were copying may have given it full attention. Other ones may have done it because they were rushed. Still others may have done it when they were drunk, I don't know. But at least the Holy Spirit did not prevent them from making errors. But we're open about it, discussing it, and see what's happening. But then, after the papyrus manuscripts, we go to the parchment manuscripts, complete Bibles we get from the 4th and the 5th century. And there is so much text to study. And when you have a lot of text to study, you learn about the scribe. What things does he get right? Where does this scribe tend to make an error? What are his strong points? What are his weak points? And by knowing that, you can be more intelligent about thinking, okay, if this is the error, then that one must be the original. That helps you in getting to grips with. Now, by the 9th century, Greeks started to use a different script. So they went from the letter by letter by letter by letter to something where you could write a couple of letters combined with one another. And from the 9th century onwards, people thought this was easier to read than this. I still disagree, but they thought it was a good idea. And from this time onwards, with this script, we have thousands of manuscripts in all sorts of forms. Which means that once the new script, here the black one, was in use, you didn't want to have manuscripts with the old script. So what do you do with the manuscript with old script? Well, you simply write the new text on top of them. Now, what do you think? This is called a palimpsest. Which text do you think I am more interested in? The old one or the new one? The old one, of course. So this is why you need PhD students, so that they can waste their eyes on sort of trying to reconstruct the older text. And it's great to have PhD students to do that. So where are we now, then, after all this? Well, we had the original book in Greek, and then the manuscript copies, and finally, in the early 16th century, we get a printed Greek edition. But even from the original and the copies, translations were made in all sorts of languages to one side or the other. And nowadays, translations are made from a printed Greek edition. And this is how a Greek or an edition looked like. You have the title in Latin, of course, because now Latin was the scholarly language in the 16th century. This one was made, the first one published by Erasmus of Rotterdam, which he happens to come from the Netherlands, which is, still feel proud of it, because now I feel a little bit like a mini Erasmus. And this was the type when movable print was, or movable letters were introduced in the printing process. And you see what movable meant, because in the process of printing a page, some of the letters moved, literally. So you get letters that have just kind of moved in. So you can have the same printed Greek New Testament, where in one print the letter is still straight up, but in the next print was made on the page, the letter has moved a little bit. So even with printing, you can have differences between the various copies. Let's see if we can get a little bit further. So this is the Latin compared to Greek. Yes, there we are. And this is what a modern printed New Testament looked like. And we are at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark here. And you will see that beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, then there are two words in a bracket, because the editors were not completely sure if these words were really in the original or not. And the words say, beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God. Here we go back to Ehrman. Ehrman would say, oh, the original Mark simply said, beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, and the words Son of God were added to make Jesus more the Son of God than he originally is, just to wrap it in already. Okay, so let's give him the benefit of the doubt. I think he was wrong here, but let's give him the benefit of the doubt. If the text just says the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, does the Gospel of Mark still teach that Jesus is the Son of God? Good one. Well, what did the centurion at the foot of the cross cry out in Mark 15? Truly, this man is the Son of God. Is there a textual variant there? No. So, if really there was the sort of thing going on to make the text say what it is supposed to say, they did not do a very good job. But it's Mark chapter 1. What happens in Mark chapter 1 a few verses down? Well, Jesus is being baptized in the Jordan. And the heavens open and there is a voice from heaven. This is my beloved Son. Well, that is quite obvious, isn't it? Jesus as Son of God. Is there a textual variant at this point? No. So, whether or not the words Son of God were there in original Mark, Mark clearly teaches that Jesus is the Son of God. Now, actually, in more recent New Testaments, as for example the one I've been working on, the same words are no longer in between brackets. Because we have figured out that this was typically a case where the words Son of God were more likely to drop out than to be added because of the typical abbreviations that were used for the term Son of God. So we can talk about this level of detail. But I would like to talk about another beautiful detail. Is there anyone in the group called Mary? Is there any Mary? No, we don't have a Mary today. Okay. The name Mary can be written two ways in Greek. One is sort of reflecting the Hebrew name Mary, which is Miriam. So you write that in Greek with an M at the end of the word, Mariam. You can also write Mary in the Greek way, namely Maria. So the difference is the M at the end of the name. So it's the Hebrew way and the Greek way. Now, the Gospel of John uses both forms for Mary. And it just changes them without any sort of logic behind it most often. But then we go to chapter 20. Or 19, I think, no, 20. Where we get Mary kind of going to the tomb. Mary, Maria, without the M, Mary, Greek form, stood weeping outside the tomb. And as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb. And then she strikes up that conversation with the gardener. At least she thinks it is the gardener. And the gardener says only one thing to Mary. What does he say? Mariam. He uses the Hebrew form, the Aramaic form of her name. And there's something beautiful there. Because at that point, she recognizes Jesus. Jesus calls her by her heart's name. No? When Mary was a little girl, how would her mother call her in for dinner? Mariam, of course, no, the Aramaic form. Jesus calls her Mary, Mariam. And what happens then? She turns, and then this is typically John, and says in Aramaic, yeah, who started? Who started the Aramaic talk? No, it's speaking in her heart's language. Jesus, of course. She says, Rabboni, which means teacher. Now, isn't it wonderful that we can study those tiny details which we cannot translate into English or in any modern language, but which have been preserved, not perfectly well, but they have been preserved in Greek, and gives you this sort of story. The detail illustrates the big story so well, then we can be sure that the rest is perfectly reliable as well. Another one. Everyone should have their favorite detail in the text. And this is a detail that is not connected to any textual variant, but it is my favorite detail. In John 21, the disciples have gone out fishing after Jesus had risen from the dead. And Jesus is on the beach, the disciples on the boat on the lake. And have the disciples caught any fish? No. So what does Jesus say? Throw out your net. And again, and what happens? They catch lots of fish. What does Peter do? Peter jumps overboard, swims to the shore. This time, no walking on water for Peter. No, he swims to the sea. He arrives at the shore. First of all, what does he see? A charcoal fire with fish on it. Well, Jesus didn't even need the fish. They were catching, the fish, there was fish already there on a charcoal fire. And Jesus is going to have that conversation with Peter about, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And of course, the 3 times, do you love me, reflect the 3 times Peter had betrayed Jesus. But what about that charcoal fire? Why does John mention there was a charcoal fire on the beach? Because back in chapter 19 or 18, when Peter was warming himself, when he was about to betray, John mentions the charcoal fire. And just here we have the detail confirms the bigger story. Where the tiny detail of the charcoal fire mentioned only with Peter warming himself and Jesus having that conversation with Peter, linking the 2 stories together. Now, and that is the beauty of the detail. I am mad about details in the text. Why? Because they make the big story even more colorful. They give it more relief. They allow us to zoom in with greater precision. If you have a tapestry and you would remove one or 2 of the threads, you would still see the big picture. Why? Because the big picture is not formed by any individual thread. It is formed by the overall message. If you're in a restaurant and you're talking to someone and you miss out some words, normally you know what the other person is saying, except when you miss out on the word not. No, that can be lethal. But normally you would be absolutely fine. Why? Because the total message does not normally depend on a single word. It is the web of words that make the meaning. And that is why I have trust in the text of the New Testament. If we zoom in on the tiniest detail of the text, yes, there may be places where I am not sure if it is Jesus loved us or Jesus loved you. But those are almost the exceptions rather than the rule. If we zoom out a little bit, the message of the text is absolutely clear. And I'm so delighted that the text, the manuscripts allow me to zoom in sometimes on the tiniest detail and see the glory of God reflected in there. Thank you very much. I think it is about time to take a little break because I may have been frying your brain by now. But if you have any questions, write them down for our Q&A. Over to you.